The afternoon of September 7th, 1876 was ordinary in Northfield, Minnesota, until it wasn't. At 2 o'clock, 3 men in linen dusters dismounted outside the First National Bank on Division Street. Their boots struck the plank sidewalk in unison. Beyond them, 5 more riders distributed themselves along the thoroughfare, some near the corner of the Scriver building, others looping their horses at the iron post outside the hardware store. Northfield was a mill town of roughly 2,000 souls, built where the Cannon River dropped through a limestone gorge. The sound of the falls was a constant bass note beneath the clatter of freight wagons. That Thursday, the air smelled of fresh-cut pine and the yeast from the bakery 2 doors down. The 3 men pushed through the bank's front door without a word. Inside, the light was cooler, filtered through tall windows that overlooked the river. Acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood sat at a desk near the vault. Beside him, bookkeeper Frank Wilcox bent over a ledger. Teller Alonzo Bunker stood at the counter, arranging stacks of currency. The door swung shut. One of the strangers pulled a revolver. Another vaulted the counter rail. The third man, still by the door, drew a knife. The words came fast and low. "Throw up your hands. We're going to rob this bank." Northfield was not supposed to be the target that day. The gang had spent the previous week scouting the First National Bank of Mankato, 30 miles southwest. On September 2nd, 1876, they had ridden through Mankato in pairs, noting the layout of the bank, the width of the streets, the proximity of livery stables. But something had spooked them. Some accounts suggest they saw too many men loitering near the bank, perhaps off-duty lawmen or suspicious townspeople. Others point to a large public gathering that would have left too many witnesses. Whatever the reason, the gang abandoned Mankato and turned north. They crossed the Minnesota River, moved through the farmland of Le Sueur County, and bivouacked in the woods south of Northfield. On the morning of September 7th, they entered Northfield in small groups, posing as cattle buyers or land surveyors. They reconnoitered the town square, the bridge, the bank. The First National Bank of Northfield was a 2-story brick building with a flat roof. It sat on the west side of Division Street, adjacent to a drugstore and a block south of the bridge. The vault was on the ground floor, visible through the teller's window. By all appearances, it was a modest country bank with modest defenses. The gang met at a grove outside town and finalized the plan. 3 men would enter the bank. 5 would guard the street, controlling the square and intimidating any passers-by. The entire operation was expected to take no more than 5 minutes. They had executed similar robberies in Missouri, Kentucky, and Iowa. Northfield would be routine. This episode is about a robbery that failed in 7 minutes and a manhunt that lasted 2 weeks. It is about the moment when a gang of ex-Confederate guerrillas, accustomed to intimidating rural banks and small-town sheriffs, encountered a population of Union Army veterans who owned rifles and were willing to use them. The Northfield raid did not end the James Younger gang, but it destroyed the gang's operational capacity and killed or imprisoned 6 of its 8 members. More importantly, it became a case study in civic resistance, a data point that challenged the myth of the invincible outlaw. The stakes were immediate and quantifiable. Joseph Lee Haywood, the acting cashier, was 39 years old, a bookkeeper by trade, and the father of 2 young daughters. He died on the floor of the bank rather than open a vault that was never locked. Alonzo Bunker, the teller, was shot in the shoulder as he fled through the rear door. Nicholas Gustafsson, a Swedish immigrant who had been in the United States for less than a year, was killed in the street by a stray bullet. He spoke no English and likely had no idea what was happening. On the other side of the ledger, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell died on Division Street under fire from townspeople. Charlie Pitts died 2 weeks later in a swamp near Madelia. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger were captured, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. Frank and Jesse James escaped, but their gang was finished. The total haul from the robbery was $26.70 in loose change. Approximately $15,000 remained in the vault. The math is unambiguous. 8 men rode into Northfield. 2 died immediately. 4 were killed or captured within 2 weeks. 2 escaped, but never reassembled a functional criminal enterprise. The cost-benefit analysis was catastrophic. This episode will reconstruct the sequence of September 7, 1876, using contemporary newspaper accounts, court records, and archival documents from the Northfield Historical Society and the Minnesota Historical Society. It will examine the mechanics of the robbery, the improvised defense mounted by the townspeople, and the 2-week pursuit that ended at Hanska Slough. It will also address the mythology that has accumulated around the event and separate the documented facts from the legend. The James Younger gang was a product of the Civil War and its aftermath. Jesse Woodson. James was born in Clay County, Missouri in 1847. His older brother, Frank, was born in 1843. During the war, both joined Confederate guerrilla units operating in western Missouri and eastern Kansas. Frank James rode with Quantrill's raiders. Jesse, younger and smaller, joined the guerrillas in 1864 and participated in skirmishes and raids under the command of leaders like William Bloody Bill Anderson. The guerrilla war in Missouri was not a conflict of uniformed armies. It was a war of ambush, reprisal, and terror. Guerrillas burned farms, executed prisoners, and scalped Union soldiers. Union forces responded with summary executions, property confiscation, and the forced depopulation of entire counties under General Order No. 11. By the time the war ended in 1865, Missouri had become a landscape of grudges. The Younger brothers came from a similar background. Cole Younger was born in 1844 in Lee's Summit, Missouri. His younger brothers, Jim and Bob, were born in 1848 and 1853. Their father, Henry Washington Younger, was a prosperous farmer and businessman. He was killed in 1862, reportedly by Union militia. Cole Younger joined Quantrill's raiders and fought through the final years of the war. After the surrender, neither the James brothers nor the Youngers were granted amnesty. Missouri had enacted harsh loyalty oaths and property restrictions aimed at former Confederates. Many ex-guerrillas found themselves unable to vote, own land, or practice certain professions. Some turned to farming or manual labor. Others turned to crime. The first bank robbery attributed to the James Younger gang occurred on February 13, 1866, in Liberty, Missouri. A group of armed men entered the Clay County Savings Association, forced the cashier to open the vault, and escaped with approximately $60,000 in bonds, currency, and gold. A bystander, a college student named George Wymore, was shot and killed as the robbers fled. The robbery bore the hallmarks of guerrilla tactics: rapid execution, overwhelming force, mounted escape. Over the next decade, the gang or men associated with it robbed banks in Lexington, Richmond, Russellville, Gallatin, and Corydon. They robbed their first train in 1873, stopping a Rock Island Line express near Adair, Iowa, and derailing the locomotive. The engineer was killed in the crash. The take was approximately $3,000. By 1876, the gang had become a hybrid of criminal enterprise and Confederate nostalgia. Newspapers in Missouri and Kentucky portrayed Jesse James as a Robin Hood figure, a victim of Reconstruction persecution. The reality was less romantic. The gang targeted banks and trains, not because of political ideology, but because that was where the money was. They killed bystanders, bank clerks, and lawmen without hesitation. Their operations were planned with military precision, but their methods were brutal. By the summer of 1876, the gang was under increasing pressure. Pinkerton detectives had been hired by railroad companies to hunt them down. Missouri had placed bounties on their heads. The gang needed a successful robbery to replenish its funds and restore morale. That need brought them to Minnesota. The 8 men who rode into Northfield on September 7, 1876 were Frank James, Jesse James, Cole Younger, Jim Younger, Bob Younger, Charlie Pitts, Clell Miller, and Bill Chadwell. Chadwell, whose real name was Bill Stiles, was a Minnesota native and acted as the gang's guide. He had scouted banks in southern Minnesota and suggested both Mankato and Northfield as potential targets. Charlie Pitts, whose real name was Samuel Wells, was a Missouri associate of the Youngers. Clell Miller was a hardened guerrilla veteran from Missouri. The division of labor was clear. Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts would enter the bank. Cole Younger and Clell Miller would guard the street outside the bank. Jim Younger, Jesse James, and Bill Chadwell would patrol the block, intimidating bystanders and preventing anyone from raising the alarm. The plan assumed that the townspeople would be unarmed and compliant. It assumed that no organized resistance would materialize in the 5 to 7 minutes required to clean out the vault. Those assumptions proved fatally incorrect. Northfield in 1876 was not a frontier hamlet. It was an established agricultural and milling center with rail connections to Minneapolis and St. Paul. The population included a significant number of Union Army veterans, many of whom had served in Minnesota volunteer regiments during the Civil War. The town had 2 hardware stores that sold firearms and ammunition. The bank itself was across the street from one of those stores. The combination of veterans, available weapons, and civic pride created conditions for resistance that the gang had not anticipated. Joseph Lee Haywood, the acting cashier, was not a banker by training. He was a bookkeeper and civic leader who had assumed temporary responsibility for the bank while the president was out of town. He was a slender man, soft-spoken, respected in the community. He had no reason to expect that he would be asked to die for a vault full of currency. Alonzo Bunker, the teller, was younger and less experienced. Frank Wilcox, the bookkeeper, was middle-aged and cautious. None of them were armed. The 3 robbers who entered the bank were masked and armed with revolvers. Contemporary accounts identify them as Frank James, Bob Younger, and Charlie Pitts, though some sources suggest variations. What is undisputed is that one of them vaulted the counter, another approached Haywood at his desk, and the third guarded the door. The demand was straightforward: open the vault. Haywood's response was equally straightforward. The vault was secured by a time lock and could not be opened until a preset hour. This was a lie. The vault had a time lock, but it was disengaged during business hours. Haywood knew this. The robbers likely suspected it, but Haywood refused to open the door. The first moments inside the bank unfolded in near silence. The robbers had expected compliance. Instead, they encountered passive resistance. Haywood sat at his desk, hands half raised, and repeated his claim about the time lock. One of the robbers grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the vault. Haywood again refused. The robber struck him across the head with the butt of a revolver. Haywood staggered, but did not yield. Meanwhile, Alonzo Bunker, the teller, edged toward the rear door. One of the robbers noticed and ordered him to stop. Bunker ignored the command and bolted. He threw open the rear door and sprinted into the alley. A shot rang out. The bullet struck Bunker in the shoulder, shattering bone but missing vital organs. He kept running down the alley, around the corner, and into a nearby building. He collapsed on the floor, bleeding but conscious. Frank Wilcox, the bookkeeper, remained frozen at his desk, too terrified to move. Outside, the 5 men guarding the street had begun to attract attention. They were riding back and forth along Division Street, shouting and firing pistols into the air. The goal was to create chaos and prevent anyone from interfering with the robbery. Instead, the noise had the opposite effect. It drew people out of shops and offices to see what was happening. One of those people was J.S. Allen, a hardware store clerk. Allen saw the riders, saw the guns, and shouted a warning. The exact wording is disputed, but the message was clear. The bank was being robbed. Within seconds, men were running toward the hardware stores. In 1876, a hardware store in a Minnesota town was not just a place to buy nails and saws. It was also an armory. Both of Northfield's hardware stores stocked rifles, shotguns, and ammunition. Within minutes, townspeople were arming themselves. Henry Wheeler, a medical student home from school, grabbed a breech-loading rifle and ran to an upstairs room of the Dampier House Hotel, which overlooked the street. A.R. Manning, a store owner, seized a rifle and took a position near the corner of the Scriver building. Others grabbed shotguns and pistols and fanned out along the street. The gang members guarding the bank found themselves under fire. The first shot came from an upper window. It missed. The second shot, fired by Henry Wheeler, struck Clell Miller in the chest. Miller fell from his horse and died on the pavement. Bill Chadwell, attempting to cover the retreat, was hit by a shot from AR. Manning. The bullet struck Chadwell in the heart. He fell dead near the bank entrance. The street was now a battlefield. Gunfire echoed off the brick storefronts. Horses reared and bolted. Smoke from black powder cartridges hung in the air. Inside the bank, the robbers realized the plan had collapsed. They abandoned the effort to open the vault and turned toward the door. As they exited, one of them, likely Frank James, turned back and fired a single shot at Joseph Lee Haywood. The bullet struck Haywood in the head, killing him instantly. His body was found later, slumped at his desk, blood pooling on the floor. The robbers burst out of the bank and onto Division Street. Cole Younger was already wounded, hit in the hip by a shotgun blast. Bob Younger had been shot in the arm. The gang mounted their horses and spurred them south, riding at full gallop through a hail of bullets. They left behind 2 dead men, $26 in change, and a town full of armed and angry citizens. The surviving 6 members of the gang rode hard out of Northfield, south along the Cannon River Road. They did not stop to count their losses or treat their wounds. They simply rode. Behind them, Northfield erupted into action. Within an hour, telegraph messages were sent to every town and county seat in southern Minnesota. The messages were terse and urgent. 8 men had attempted to rob the bank. 2 were dead. 6 were fleeing south. 3 civilians were dead or wounded. By evening, posses were assembling in Faribault, Waterville, Mankato, and Madelia. The pursuit of the James Younger gang would become the largest manhunt in Minnesota history to that date. The geography worked against the fugitives. Southern Minnesota in September 1876 was not open prairie. It was a patchwork of farms, woodlots, and wetlands, crisscrossed by roads and rail lines. The population density was low, but the land was not empty. Every farm had a family. Every crossroads had a store. The gang could not move without being seen. The first confirmed sighting came on the evening of September 7th, near Dundas, a hamlet 6 miles southwest of Northfield. A farmer reported seeing 6 men riding in single file, one of them doubled over in the saddle. The posse from Northfield, led by Sheriff Ira Barton, followed the trail south. By nightfall, they had lost contact. The gang, meanwhile, was in desperate condition. Cole Younger's hip wound was bleeding heavily. Bob Younger's shattered arm was useless. All 6 men were exhausted, hungry, and soaked from crossing the Cannon River. They had no food and no clear destination. Their plan, such as it was to reach the Iowa border and disappear into the network of sympathizers and safe houses that had sheltered them in Missouri. But Iowa was more than 100 miles south, and every mile was contested. On September 8th, the gang stole fresh horses from a farm near Waterville. The farmer, alerted by neighbors, fired at them but missed. The gang continued west, skirting Elysian and German Lake. They avoided roads and stayed in the timber. At night, they slept in abandoned barns or under trees. They ate raw corn and whatever they could scavenge. The pursuit was relentless. Posses from Rice, Le Sueur, and Blue Earth counties converged on the area. Telegraph operators relayed sightings in real time. Farmers armed themselves and watched the roads. On September 13th, 6 days after the robbery, the gang made a critical decision. They split up. Frank and Jesse James, both uninjured and mounted on stronger horses, broke away and headed west. The younger brothers and Charlie Pitts, all wounded and on foot after their horses gave out, continued south toward Madelia. The decision made tactical sense. A smaller group could move faster and attract less attention, but it also sealed the fate of the Youngers and Pitts. The final confrontation came on September 21st, 1876, near Hanska Slough, a wetland 2 miles west of Madelia. A local farmer named Oscar Sorbel spotted 4 men hiding in the brush. He rode to Madelia and alerted the sheriff. A posse of 7 men, led by Captain W. W. Murphy, surrounded the slough. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Murphy called out for the fugitives to surrender. The response was gunfire. The shootout lasted 15 minutes. The 4 men in the slough were armed with revolvers and had taken cover behind fallen logs. The posse had rifles in superior numbers. Charlie Pitts was killed almost immediately, shot through the chest. Bob Younger was hit again, this time in the jaw. Jim Younger took a bullet in the face that shattered his upper jaw and destroyed his right eye. Cole Younger, already carrying 11 wounds from Northfield and the 2-week flight, was hit again in the chest. Despite his injuries, he called out that they would surrender. The 3 younger brothers emerged from the slough, hands raised, barely able to stand. They were transported to Madelia, treated by a local doctor, and held under guard. On September the 23rd, they were moved to Faribault and formally charged with murder and robbery. The trial was brief. On November 20th, 1876, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. They were each sentenced to life in prison at the Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater. Frank and Jesse James, meanwhile, had vanished. They traveled west through Dakota Territory, then south through Nebraska and Kansas. By early October, they had returned to Missouri, where they disappeared into the network of family and friends that had always protected them. The James Younger Gang, as a functional criminal enterprise, ceased to exist on September 21st, 1876, in a swamp near Madelia. The immediate aftermath of the Northfield raid produced a cascade of consequences, some predictable, others surprising. Joseph Lee Haywood's death became a national story. Newspapers across the country published accounts of the cashier who had died rather than surrender the bank's money. The narrative fit a particular template: the honest man standing against outlawry, the triumph of civic virtue over violence. Within weeks, a subscription fund was organized to support Haywood's widow and 2 daughters. The fund was promoted by the banking industry, which saw Haywood as a martyr and a useful symbol. By the end of 1876, the Haywood Fund had raised over $12,600, a substantial sum equivalent to more than 10 years of a cashier's salary. The fund was distributed to Haywood's family and used to erect a monument in Northfield's cemetery. The monument stands today, a granite obelisk inscribed with Haywood's name and the date of his death. Nicholas Gustafsson, the Swedish immigrant killed in the street, received no monument and no fund. His death was noted in the local newspaper but quickly forgotten. He was buried in a pauper's grave. His family, if he had any in the United States, left no record. The disparity in how the 2 deaths were remembered reflects the social hierarchies of the time. Haywood was a middle-class American with a family, a profession, and a place in the community. Gustafsson was a foreign laborer with no English and no connections. One death was commemorated, the other was erased. The financial cost of the raid was negligible for the bank, but significant for the town. The First National Bank of Northfield lost $26.70. The vault, which the robbers never opened, held approximately $15,000. The bank resumed operations the following day. The town, however, bore the cost of the pursuit. Posses had to be organized, fed, and armed. Telegraph messages had to be sent. Rewards had to be posted. The total cost to Rice County and its neighbors exceeded several $1,000s, none of which was recovered from the captured gang members. The younger brothers had no assets to seize. The legal proceedings were swift. The three youngers were arraigned in Faribault on November 9, 1876. They were charged with murder in the first degree for the death of Joseph Lee Haywood and assault with intent to kill for the wounding of Alonzo Bunker. They were also charged with robbery. The trial was scheduled for November 20th. On that date, all three pleaded guilty. The plea was strategic. Minnesota law prohibited the execution of defendants who pleaded guilty. By pleading guilty, the youngers avoided the gallows, but accepted life sentences. The sentences were handed down immediately. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger were transported to Stillwater Prison, where they would spend the next 25 years. The conditions at Stillwater were harsh. Prisoners worked 10-hour days in the prison workshop, manufacturing tools and furniture. Discipline was strict. Violence was common. Bob Younger, the youngest, contracted tuberculosis. He died in prison on September 16, 1889, at the age of 36. Jim Younger was paroled in 1901 but struggled to adapt to life outside prison. He committed suicide in 1902. Cole Younger was paroled in 1901 and eventually pardoned in 1903. He spent his final years giving lectures about the evils of crime, a performance that combined genuine remorse with calculated self-promotion. He died in 1916 at the age of 72. Frank and Jesse James remained fugitives. Jesse continued to rob banks and trains, though never with the same success or scale as before Northfield. His gang was smaller, less experienced, and constantly under surveillance. On April 3, 1882, Jesse was shot and killed by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang who had negotiated a deal with Missouri authorities. Frank James surrendered 6 months later. He was tried twice, once in Missouri and once in Alabama, and acquitted both times. He lived until 1915, dying at the age of 72 on the family farm in Clay County, Missouri. The Northfield raid exposed the operational limits of guerrilla tactics in a post-war environment. The gang had relied on methods honed during the Civil War: rapid assault, overwhelming firepower, and intimidation of civilians. Those methods had worked in Missouri, where the population was divided, law enforcement was weak, and sympathizers were common. They failed in Northfield for 3 reasons. First, the population was hostile. Minnesota had sent more than 24,000 men to fight for the Union during the Civil War. Many of those men had returned to towns like Northfield. They were familiar with firearms, comfortable with violence, and unsympathetic to ex-Confederates. The gang had assumed the townspeople would be passive. They were not. Second, the townspeople had access to weapons. The hardware stores on Division Street stocked rifles, shotguns, and ammunition. Within minutes of the alarm being raised, a dozen men were armed and in position. The gang's revolvers, effective at close range, were outmatched by long arms fired from cover. The technological balance favored the defenders. Third, the gang had no exit strategy. The plan was to rob the bank and ride out of town before any organized resistance could form. When that plan collapsed, the gang had no fallback. They fled south with no clear destination, no supplies, and no support network. The 2-week pursuit was a slow-motion collapse, each day narrowing the options until surrender or death were the only outcomes. The mythology of the James Younger gang obscures these realities. In dime novels and later films, Jesse James is portrayed as a romantic outlaw, a victim of injustice driven to crime by oppressive forces. The Northfield raid does not fit that narrative. It was a botched robbery that resulted in 3 civilian deaths and the destruction of the gang. There was no nobility in it, no higher cause. It was a crime that failed because the victims fought back. The documentary record supports this conclusion. The court files from the Younger brothers' trial contain no political manifestos, no appeals to Confederate loyalty, no claims of persecution. The testimony focuses on the mechanics of the robbery: who entered the bank, who fired which shots, who was responsible for which deaths. The letters and diaries of the townspeople who participated in the defense contain no doubt about the righteousness of their actions. They saw themselves as defending their community against criminals, and the evidence supports that view. The one area where the record is ambiguous is the death of Joseph Lee Haywood. The question of who fired the fatal shot has never been conclusively answered. Contemporary accounts suggest it was Frank James, but no witness saw the shooting. The robbers were masked, and the interior of the bank was chaotic. Haywood's family and the banking industry promoted the narrative of the heroic cashier who died protecting the vault. That narrative is true as far as it goes, but it also simplifies. Haywood's refusal to open the vault was brave, but it was also fatal. Had he opened the vault, the robbers would have taken the money and left. Haywood, Bunker, and Gustafson would have lived. The bank would have lost $15,000, a sum it could have absorbed. The question of whether Haywood's resistance was justified is not one the historical record can answer. It is a question of values, not facts. What the record does show is that Haywood's death galvanized the town's response. The alarm that was raised, the weapons that were seized, the shots that were fired, all happened in the space of 5 to 7 minutes. The speed and intensity of the response suggest a population that was prepared, psychologically and materially, to defend itself. The long-term consequences of the Northfield raid extended beyond the immediate participants. The raid marked a turning point in the mythology of the American outlaw. Prior to Northfield, the James Younger gang had been portrayed in sympathetic terms by large segments of the press, particularly in Missouri and the South. They were seen as victims of Reconstruction, as men pushed into crime by an unjust system. Northfield undermined that narrative. The raid demonstrated that the gang was willing to kill unarmed civilians in the pursuit of money. The death of Nicholas Gustafson, a man who had no connection to the bank and no ability to resist, was particularly damaging. The image of Swedish immigrant being shot in the street did not fit the Robin Hood archetype. Newspapers in the North and Midwest seized on the story. Editorials condemned the gang as murderers and called for increased law enforcement. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, already pursuing the gang, intensified its efforts. State and federal authorities raised bounties. The sanctuary that had protected the James brothers in Missouri began to erode. The raid also influenced banking security. In the aftermath, banks across the Midwest installed time locks, reinforced vaults, and hired armed guards. The First National Bank of Northfield became a case study in both vulnerability and resistance. Banking journals published accounts of the raid and recommended countermeasures. The narrative of the armed citizenry defending the bank became a template for how communities should respond to bank robberies. This had political implications. In the 1870s, debates over gun ownership and public order were shaped by regional and partisan divisions. The Northfield raid provided ammunition, literally and figuratively, for those who argued that an armed citizenry was a check on crime. The fact that the townspeople had armed themselves from hardware stores without waiting for law enforcement was highlighted in editorials and political speeches. The raid became a parable about self-reliance and civic virtue. At the same time, the raid exposed the limits of that narrative. The townspeople had defended the bank, but they had not captured the gang. That required a coordinated multi-county pursuit involving hundreds of men and 2 weeks of effort. The final capture at Hanska Slough was the result of systematic police work, tracking, surveillance, and a willingness to surround and overwhelm the fugitives. The myth of the lone hero with a rifle was balanced by the reality of organized law enforcement. The economic impact of the raid was localized but real. Northfield's economy, based on milling and agriculture, was not disrupted by the raid itself. But the town's reputation was enhanced. Northfield became famous as the place where the James Younger gang had been defeated. Tourists visited the bank. Newspapers published maps and photographs. The town embraced its role in the story and used it to promote itself. By the 1880s, the bank building was a landmark, and the raid was commemorated in local histories. The human cost, however, was permanent. Joseph Lee Haywood left behind a widow, 2 daughters, and a ledger of unfinished business. Alonzo Bunker recovered from his wound, but carried the scar for the rest of his life. Nicholas Gustafson left no descendants and no legacy. The 2 gang members killed in Northfield, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, were buried in unmarked graves. Their families, if they had any, did not claim the bodies. The 3 younger brothers spent decades in prison, their lives consumed by the consequences of 7 minutes in Northfield. Charlie Pitts died in a swamp, his body returned to Missouri and buried without ceremony. The total human cost of the raid was 9 dead, 3 imprisoned and dozens of others wounded, traumatized, or bereaved. The James Younger gang's attempt to rob the First National Bank of Northfield on September 7, 1876, lasted approximately 7 minutes from the moment the first robber entered the bank to the moment the last survivor fled south on Division Street. In those 7 minutes, 3 men died, 3 were wounded, and a criminal enterprise that had operated for a decade was effectively destroyed. The gang had planned for a quick, clean robbery. They had scouted the town, selected the target, and divided the labor. They had executed similar operations in Missouri, Kentucky, and Iowa without significant resistance. Northfield was supposed to be routine. It was not routine because the townspeople fought back. They armed themselves from hardware stores, took positions at windows and street corners, and opened fire. The resistance was not organized by law enforcement. It was spontaneous, decentralized, and effective. Within minutes, 2 gang members were dead and 2 were wounded. The survivors fled under a hail of gunfire, leaving behind their haul of $26.70. The pursuit that followed was the largest manhunt in Minnesota history to that date. It involved hundreds of men from multiple counties, coordinated by telegraph and guided by systematic tracking. The fugitives were pursued through farms, woodlots, and wetlands. They were denied food, shelter, and fresh horses. They were forced to split up. The final confrontation at Hanska Slough on September 21, 1876 was the inevitable conclusion of a pursuit that had given the gang no room to maneuver. The 3 younger brothers surrendered. Charlie Pitts died. Frank and Jesse James escaped, but never reconstituted the gang. The raid's legacy is complex. It was a victory for law enforcement and a demonstration of civic resistance. It was also a tragedy for the civilians who died, and a brutal example of the cost of criminal violence. The mythology that has grown up around the raid, particularly the romanticization of the James brothers, obscures the reality of what happened. The reality is in the numbers. 8 men attempted a robbery. 2 died immediately. 1 died 2 weeks later. 3 spent the rest of their lives in prison. 2 escaped but lived as fugitives. 3 civilians died. 3 were wounded. The financial take was $26.70. The cost, measured in lives and years, was incalculable. The sun was setting over the Cannon River when the last of the wounded were carried into the makeshift hospital set up in the hotel. Joseph Lee Haywood's body had been removed from the bank and lay in the back room of the drugstore, covered with a sheet. Nicholas Gustafson's body had been taken to the undertaker. The street was quiet now, the gun smoke dispersed, the blood washed away by volunteers with buckets of water. By nightfall, the telegraph wires were humming with news of the raid. Papers in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, and New York would carry the story the next day. Within a week, it would be national news. Within a month, it would be legend. But on the evening of September 7, 1876, the people of Northfield were simply exhausted. They had defended their town, buried their dead, and tended their wounded. The bank would reopen the next day. The hardware stores would restock their ammunition. Life would continue. 50 years later, in 1926, the town of Northfield would erect a monument on Division Street. a bronze plaque marking the site of the robbery. The plaque would list the names of the participants, the casualties, and the outcome. It would describe the raid as a turning point in the history of the American West, the moment when a town stood up to an outlaw gang and won. The plaque is still there, bolted to the brick wall of the old bank building. Tourists photograph it, historians cite it, school groups visit it. The numbers on the plaque are precise. September 7th, 1876. 8 robbers, 2 killed, 3 captured, $26.70. Those numbers tell the story more clearly than any legend ever could.